Melflufen is a peptide drug conjugate that obviously got accelerated approval here in the US about a year and a half ago, and then has now got full approval by the European Medicines Agency in Europe. But unfortunately, because of some challenges seen with some of the data from the Ocean study, which was one of the confirmatory phase 3s that reported earliest, has not seen its way forward in terms of continuing accelerated approval in the US. So that has actually been taken back and revoked. Having said that, the full approval in the European Medicines Agency is particularly interesting because based on the same data and their interpretation of the results, I think has been both very fair and at the same time positive. In the US, I think there are some understandable concerns on the regulatory side, but very importantly, I think we're looking forward to future studies to address the concerns and make sure that we can move forward to see the value of this drug, because certainly we saw some preliminary data from the so-called Lighthouse study that is now going to be presented in Europe at the EMN meeting, which is really quite encouraging. And I'm not going to step out of bounds there to say what it is until it's formally presented. But even though that trial was stopped early, there certainly weren't any safety considerations, and also the responses and the outcomes, even despite this relatively small number, are quite encouraging. So I'm hopeful that Melflufen will be able to really prove its mettle, which I believe it will, in the context of further clinical studies in the US. And obviously it's fully approved in Europe, so access to it in Europe will obviously continue full on. But it does reflect a challenging time in the regulatory environment for myeloma drugs. And obviously there are a number in which this has been seen. Panobinostat, you mentioned, Tom, earlier. Obviously that's approved in Europe. It's not approved in the United States. And there's complex reasons for that, but probably the most important one in the US is the fact that the post-marketing requirements were a source of concern in terms of the data generated was not considered adequate to address what's called the PMR. And so as a result of that, it's no longer available, unfortunately, in the US, but it is available in Europe. Further studies, if they do happen, I hope they do, because I think the drug, again, could potentially have value. But again, without those studies, I think in the US, there's not really a possibility of them being revisited. So, we'll have to see. Interestingly, in that same sort of context, Belantamab Mafodotin obviously ran into the same kind of difficulties that Melflufen did with the confirmatory phase 3 trial, so-called DREAM3, failing to meet its primary endpoint, although in fairness, DREAM3 didn't meet its endpoint. In contrast, Ocean actually did meet its endpoint. But that notwithstanding, there were no new safety concerns seen in DREAM3, but because some of the outcome data didn't quite meet the expectations, the availability of Belantamab in the US commercially has been pulled back. But the good news is that studies with Belantamab are ongoing, and there will be no interruption to that process. And I think I'm very hopeful that subsequent trials with Belantamab Mafodotin coming in will further show the value of it. Because as an antibody drug conjugate, it's not dissimilar in some ways to how you think of Melflufen. It's a delivery system for a cytotoxic warhead. So essentially BCMA, that's the Belantamab targeting portion, delivers Mafodotin. And whilst that seems, it's an antibody drug conjugate, then that seems fairly straightforward. It's a really very interesting strategy because it generates immunogenic cell death. And in that context, what we see, and we actually see something similar, not dissimilar, I should say, with even Melflufen. But the bottom line with Belantamab is that it's a very potent off-the-shelf drug, which we've really got a handle on the keratopathy now. It's reversible, it's manageable. You simply space out the interval infusions from, say, not 3 weeks, but to 6 weeks and even to 12 weeks. And we see great activity, particularly in combination. And so it's BCMA targeting. Keratopathy is its only major side effect in my experience. There are some others, but they're minor by comparison. And the keratopathy is manageable. So I think as we go forward in myeloma, having all these opportunities is very important, Tom, because bispecifics and CAR-Ts are fabulous, but their availability is frankly limited, and their applicability to elderly patients, to patients that are underserved, communities that are underserved, and patients who do not want to come into the hospital under any circumstances. We need, or under only emergency circumstances, we need all these options for our patients, not just to be limited to specific, very exciting, but nonetheless not necessarily very available approaches.